First of all, congratulations. Thank you for staying all this time, last 2.5 days. I think tomorrow I'll have Silk Road Conference withdrawal fever. So thank you, German Marshall Fund and the Aspen Institute, and Mircea Giona. You've just facilitated so many connections and sharing of information. I learned so much. I really appreciate it. And Gabriela Radu, who actually put this slide up so it helps you see what we're all talking about, the Silk Road economic belt as well as the maritime. And following such great presentations, I have to kind of fill in some holes, areas that weren't covered. So I'll give it a little bit more of a background. China, Xi Jinping floats a lot of these concepts like China Dream, and he talked about the dream. And then it's the Silk Road economic belt. And I know Ambassador Costia said it's a little more concrete, but I think it's kind of developing as a concept. And I think the system is you kind of float the concept and then you see what happens. So going back a little bit, and also Hu Jintao actually was the first one to enunciate this, and Xi Jinping has filled it in more, so it's evolving as we go along. So with, of course, 2008, we had the sovereign debt crisis, and this gave China a wonderful opportunity to invest in Europe, especially the Central Eastern European countries. And this might have been one of the ideas to play a bigger role in the region. Why do they invest in Central and Eastern Europe? Because it's got a skilled workforce, and it's easier to get in there than in Western Europe. So I'm trying to keep this short and to the point, but China sees Europe as a strategic resource. First and foremost, it's a market for Chinese goods. And this room, as Ambassador Costi told me before we started this presentation, made history 1 year ago. In this very room, all the ambassadors met for the 16+1. So keep that in mind, and I'll develop that just a little further. Also, Europe has 3 major resources for China. So first, as a market for Chinese goods. Second, for advanced dual-use technology that they can't buy in the United States. So Europe it has an arms embargo, which each member state interprets individually, but Europe has been a big resource for technology transfer to China. And then, of course, food security. China buys a large proportion of its food from the United States, so they see that as an Achilles heel. So they want to develop more contact with Europe, especially Ukraine before the crisis, to buy food, and those empty trains would eventually maybe be filled with grain or other objects from food. So how did this concept begin? Now, we all know about the East and South China Sea tensions with Japan in the East China Sea and the 6 littoral states in the South China Sea, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan. So in Chinese thought, the famous art of war, Sun Tzu's saying is when the enemy advances, we go in the other direction. So Wang Jixi wrote a paper in October 2012, and it was called Marching West. So this is based on ancient Chinese strategy because the US was putting so much pressure on the East China Sea and South China Sea that China decided, we'll look in the opposite direction to take the pressure off us. So even at the conference 2 days ago, when Director Shen spoke, I asked him about these competing narratives because he said even in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he confirmed that it's not clarified yet. So there's some that believe that they should march west, whereas others think, no, that's not a good idea. So there's a division within the Chinese Foreign Ministry on this. So this idea of marching west has 3 main drivers, as I mentioned: energy security, food security, because in China there's a huge amount of environmental degradation and it's almost dangerous for them to grow certain products, so they're relying more and more on food imports. And of course they want improved connectivity, which we've been discussing for the last 2.5 days. And this is important for China's core interests, which include energy and food security. So as I mentioned earlier, this room played a very important role about the 16+1. And just in casual conversations, I realized a lot of people aren't familiar with the 16+1. So I'll give you a brief outline of what that is. Very new, so in 2011, there was a new forum created, and it was the 11 EU member states. So pretty much the new accession member states, and then the 5 EU candidate countries, so Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. So why these countries? Why does China like these countries so much? Why did it create this body that overlaps the EU and is in the EU and outside the EU? They're linguistically different, they have different religions. The only thing that they have in common is that they were actually all former communist states. And they have this experience, historical experience that they can share with China. So China uses this narrative that we're developing an economy and we can help you too. So we have this shared story and we can work together. So Austria thought, this is a great group, can we join? And China said, no, you're too developed. So they didn't want Austria in this group. So it was very clear they had special designs for the 16+1. Also, back in Brussels, this has caused a lot of concern. This kind of special group that China has, they see it, is it something we should fear? Should we worry about it? So they're really trying to keep an eye on it. They're fearful that they might create a pro-China lobby within the EU, and that this could actually be a lever of power or influence policymaking back in Brussels. And as I said, in this meeting room here, it was upgraded back in November and it was formally institutionalized. Before that, it was more of a casual grouping. And also, not that I'm a fan of Donald Rumsfeld, but he infamously talked about old and new Europe. And during the Iraq War, he talked about old Europe and new Europe, that new Europe was actually much more supportive of the US. And so with this Chinese influence, a place which traditionally supported US policy might actually be closer to the China camp, looking down the road. So this room also enunciated the greater neighborhood policy. So with this idea of the Silk Road economic belt, instead of being on the periphery, they tell Europe, you're in our neighborhood. You know, it's in our mind, we see it as very far away, but we're the same, and we're close, and you're my neighbor, and I embrace you. So China says they're part of the greater neighborhood. Also, we had a visit to Brussels in March by President Obama, followed quickly by a visit in March by Xi Jinping. Why all this interest in Brussels all of a sudden? We have the TTIP negotiations going on, and it's the first time ever in the history of EU-China relations that the top leader actually made it to Brussels. So the first time in 40 years he came. So Xi Jinping, excuse me, a lot of analysis, my personal analysis is that China is very fearful of TTIP, and they've actually repackaged the Silk Road economic belt as a possible alternative. Now, I know some people think that's absurd, but this is how China, some people are looking at TTIP versus Silk Road economic belt. So you can look east or you can look west. And China's trying to show that Europe has alternatives and that this is a great area of growth or possible growth. And trade between the EU and China is no longer increasing as it was over the last decades. I mean, it used to be huge, 20% year on year, but last year was only 2%, and it's very flat. So this is a result of the economy, and China is looking for a way to transfer their kind of excess capacity, and this is a perfect region to do it. China and EU have very similar, the 16+1 in China have some similarities about overcapacity or within Europe, so the adjustments might be very painful. But my personal opinion is that these negotiations which are going on between the EU and China, maybe a better strategy would be for Europe to also try to get market access for European companies within China. This is becoming a real problem for them. Instead of opening up so much for China, I think maybe Europe should have a little more access to the Chinese market. Okay, and then trying to connect the dots, because we spent a lot of time about energy and Russia, and I'm trying to try to pull these separate strands together in the last presentation here. In China, Putin is very, very popular. In fact, there's a new book out, and he's called Putin the Great. And the Chinese really admire him because he stood up to the West. And this idea of universal values, which the 2 panels ago, Ambassador spoke about. This is something that China has made very clear. They do not believe in universal values. The document 9, which was leaked, they're called Western values, and they're not allowed to be discussed in China nor taught in China. So this is kind of, Russian and China kind of standing up to West and what we consider universal values might be a serious problem for us down the road. As we know, China withheld support of Western sanctions against Russia, and China, which never says it interferes in other countries, has told the EU to not do any more sanctions against Russia. China has effectively stayed out of the way in Ukraine, and in exchange, they expect Moscow to stay out of their way in their own disputes in the South and East China Sea. So here we see kind of economic territory that might be created, the special relationship between Europe and China, and what might that mean for the transatlantic relationship? If China is trying to influence Europeans, I see it as a triangular relationship between Beijing, Brussels, and Washington, D.C., and it's constantly being renegotiated. So I hope I've covered everything. And one comment about Zheng He. Why are we talking about the Maritime Silk Road now? What happened to Zheng He? After he did his trips and brought the plague to Africa, that was one of the free things he brought with him, we see the emperor told, burn all your ships, we don't need to go anywhere. So China is actually reasserting themselves in the region because historically, maybe that was the biggest mistake they ever made. They had massive ships and they decided to burn them. They were the center of the universe and they didn't need anything. So there's kind of a catch-up period now, and we're seeing it with both the Silk Road and Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road. So thanks for your attention.